After being left alone by her children, the elderly Mary included an important message in her will. But let's see how things really went. On the quiet outskirts of Chicago, a large house with a well-kept garden stood out above the others. It was the home of Mary White, a 75-year-old woman famous in the neighborhood for her affability and for the care she took of the beautiful, brilliant flowers in her lawn. Yet the bright colors of his garden contrasted with the melancholy of the silence that enveloped his home. Anne and Paul, her children, had moved to South America years ago. Their visits, initially frequent, had become increasingly sporadic until they stopped completely. Sitting on the antique armchair in her living room, Mary looked at the photos of her family. The young faces of Anne and Paul next to that of their late husband seemed to belong to a remote era. Where will Anne and Paul be? Mary murmured in a trembling voice as tears clouded her eyes. But a ringing telephone interrupted the silence. Mary replied. "Mom, it's me, Paul," said the voice on the other end of the phone. "Oh, Paul, it's been a long time. I missed you," Mary replied, her voice hopeful and full of tiredness. "I was thinking we should spend more time together. We're considering a visit. What do you think?" The proposal lit a glimmer of happiness in Mary. "That would be wonderful, my son. I can't wait," she said, unaware that that call would be the beginning of a series of events that would change her life forever. Months later, on a cold autumn night, the headlights of a car illuminated the entrance to Mary's house. Anne and Paul, with worried expressions, got out of the vehicle and headed towards the door. Anne, the youngest, with makeup applied perfectly to hide the signs of aging, looked at Paul with an uncertain expression and said, "Do you really think I believe this story?" They were near the door and were greeted by Mary's radiant smile. "Anne, Paul," he exclaimed, embracing them warmly. "Come in, I've prepared dinner." During dinner, Anne and Paul filled the old house with laughter and stories about their life in the big city, talking about their jobs, friends, and the challenges they were facing, but omitting a crucial part of their lives: their desperate financial situation. In the following days, Anne and Paul's visits became more frequent. They helped Mary with the household chores, brought her gifts, and made all kinds of gestures that fueled Mary's hope of having her children back by her side. "Mom," Paul began one evening, "Anne and I talked. You miss us, and we miss you too. How about selling this house and coming to live with us in South America?" Mary was surprised by the proposal. Tears of joy welled up in her eyes. He could hardly believe what he heard. The idea of living with her children again was all she wanted. Unfortunately, however, he did not imagine that his dreams would soon become a nightmare. One evening, he made a decision. "Paul, Anne, I've thought a lot about what you've proposed to me," Mary began with a trembling voice, "and I've decided to sell a house and come and live with you." The brothers exchanged furtive glances whose faces hid the satisfaction they felt. "Oh, Mother, we are so happy," Anne exclaimed as she stood up to hug Mary. "You will like Milan, I'm sure of it." Once the decision was made, things moved quickly. The house was put on the market, and to Mary's surprise, it sold in no time. She soon found herself surrounded by boxes as her belongings were packed for the move. As she packed up the photo albums, Mary felt a pang of sadness. "I will miss this place," he said softly, stroking the frame of an old photograph. "Don't worry, Mom," Paul said, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You will like South America, and above all, we will be together." At that moment, Maria didn't notice the knowing look that Paul and Anne had exchanged. She was far from imagining the true intention behind their words of comfort. The big step finally happened. Mary, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, said goodbye to her home and the neighborhood she loved so much. Paul and Anne welcomed her in the car and took her to the big Southern America. "Mom, you will like the view from our apartment," Anne said, trying to lighten the heavy atmosphere. "And the parks, the shops, everything will be new and exciting." Upon her arrival, Mary did not find a welcoming apartment, but the entrance to a retirement home. The walls were painted in pastel colors, and the gardens were well kept. "Paul, Anne, maybe there's a mistake," said Mary, confused. "It's a retirement home," Mum Paul began with a trembling voice, avoiding her gaze. "We are so sorry that we were not honest from the beginning. We cannot keep another person in our apartment, and with the money from the sale of your house, you will have a safe and comfortable stay here." Mary felt her heart tighten. She looked at Anne, hoping to find out that it was just a bad joke, but Anne's face was serious and her eyes were full of tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I promise we'll come see you whenever we can." And so, alone and abandoned in a retirement home, feeling a profound sadness and a sense of betrayal that left her disconcerted, with tears running down her face, she entered the new place that would be her home without knowing that this sad turning point in his life was about to give way to surprising new beginnings. Life in the nursing home was a big change for Mary. She had lost the freedom of her home, the familiarity of her garden, and above all the hope of being with her children again. But she was a woman with a strong spirit, and she decided to face the situation. One afternoon, while walking in the garden of the residence, he saw an old house for sale across the street. Something about that house caught his attention. It seemed as lonely as hers was. Without wasting time, remembering his hidden savings, he decided to buy it. When she shared the news with her children, they laughed, doubting Mary's ability to take care of an old, empty house. But Mary was determined. "I'm stronger than you think," he said, looking Paul and Anne in the eyes. "And this will be my home." On moving day, Mary once again found herself surrounded by boxes, but this time there was a sense of anticipation and hope. Shortly after moving, he met his neighbors, a young couple with 6-year-old twins. John and Sue had been kind and had offered to help her with the necessary repairs to the house. "Mrs. Mary, this house needs some love," John said as he looked at the worn house, "and I believe we can help you." Thus, a new friendship was born, and Mary, even in a difficult situation, found herself surrounded by people who truly cared about her. It was a turning point that he didn't expect, but that he deeply appreciated. The following months were a flurry of activity. John and Sue, together with their adorable twins, helped Mary transform the old house into a home. They painted and repaired the walls of the house, and Mary, despite her age, was determined to help in any way she could. "Miss Mary needs to rest," Sue scolded as Mary insisted on helping plant flowers in the garden. "My dear, I have never felt so alive," replied Mary, whose face radiated joy. The old house began to come to life. The walls received new colors, the garden flourished, and the once solitary house was now full of conversation. Paul and Anne, observing from afar, could not believe the transformation. They didn't expect Mary to be capable of such a feat. Their surprise, however, turned to anger and resentment. "Mom, you really surprised us," Paolo said during one visit, his voice full of false joy. "Yes, Mom, you showed us how independent you are," added Anna, whose smile didn't reach her eyes. But Maria, happy with her new life, and regardless of her children's feelings, simply smiled and thanked them once again, unaware of the storm that was coming. One afternoon, as she walked down the creaking stairs to the basement, Mary noticed something strange. In one corner of the dark, dank basement was a large, locked old trunk. Mary's curiosity was immediately piqued. She opened the trunk and inside found an impressive collection of jewels and gold, each piece shinier than the last. Mary was shocked, struggling to believe the good fortune she had discovered in her new home. She decided to keep the discovery secret, sharing it only with her lawyer, who advised her to keep her valuables safe until she decided what to do. Mary's health began to decline, and old age proved to be a terrible adversary. Yet she always found joy in the little things. "You have to take care of yourself," warned Sue, worried for her friend. "And that's what I do, dear." "That's what I do," Mary replied with a smile. "I'm surrounded by people I love, and that's all that matters." Meanwhile, Paul and Anne were still obsessed with their mother's wealth and convinced that she was hiding a fortune. They made plans to ensure that that wealth ended up in their hands without knowing of the treasure that Mary had discovered. On a cold winter night, Mary sat in her favorite armchair, stared at the flickering fireplace, and made a decision. She called her lawyer and began planning her will. The choices he made that evening would be the most surprising final chapter of his life. Mary's health continued to deteriorate over the following months, although she insisted on keeping her smile, encouraging Alex and Matt with her stories, and assuring John and Sue that she was fine. "You are the family I chose," she said, holding their hands, "and I couldn't be more grateful." One day, when Paul and Anne went to visit her, the tension was palpable. They noticed their mother's fragility, and although she was emotionally distant, the reality of the situation hit them. "You should go to the hospital," Paul said, trying to keep his voice steady. Anne nodded, avoiding her mother's gaze. "No, my dears," Mary replied, looking at them with tired but determined eyes. "This is my home, and this is where I want to spend my last days." Paul and Anne's visit was short and embarrassing. When they left, a strange calm settled over the house. Mary looked at them from the window with an unmistakable sadness in her eyes. "I hope they find happiness one day," she whispered to herself. "They deserve it, despite everything." That would be Mary's last meeting with her children. Somehow he knew he was running out of time. But he wasn't afraid. He had his family, John, Sue, Alex, and Matt, and he had his final plan, a plan that would bring justice and balance to everyone. The end came softly for Mary on a cold winter morning. She took her last breath with Sue holding her hand. The loss was felt by everyone in the neighborhood. The kind lady who had brought so much warmth into their lives was gone. "I promised to take care of everything," Sue murmured, feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. "Rest in peace, Mary." Paul and Anne received the news with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the loss of their mother and relief for the prospect of the inheritance they believed to be theirs. The community gathered en masse for Mary's funeral. John and Sue, along with Alex and Matt, received condolences from friends and neighbors, all with stories of how Mary had touched their lives. At the end of the funeral, a serious-looking lawyer approached the family. "I'm Peter Greek, Mary's lawyer," he said, handing them some sealed envelopes. He asked for them to be delivered at his funeral. "The will be read next week." John and Sue looked at each other, while Paul and Anne barely managed to hide their anticipation. "Thank you, Mr. Greek," John said, accepting the envelopes with a nod. And so, with Maria's passing, a new series of events began. Maria's choice had just begun to unfold, promising to surprise everyone with its latest revelations. In the days following the funeral, Luca and Sylvia, together with Alessandro and Matteo, remembered Maria. The house felt empty without his presence, and everyone remembered the love and warmth he brought into their lives. The sealed envelopes that Alessandro Greco, the lawyer, had brought with him, sat on the dining room table, a constant reminder of Maria's last message. Finally, one afternoon, Luca decided to open it. "Dear family, if you are reading this letter, I am gone, but don't be sad. Remember the laughter and the stories shared. That's what really matters. As for the will, you will find out everything while reading the lawyer. Please know that I tried to do what I thought was right. John and Sue, you were my salvation and my family when I needed it most. And Alex and Matt, you were the joy that illuminated my last years. Thank you for everything you have done for me. Mary." The family finished reading the letter with tears in their eyes. Mary's love for them was evident in every word. But what did he mean by what I think is right? The day of reading the will had arrived. In the esteemed lawyer's office, curiosity was in the air, but there was also a sense of apprehension. John and Sue, Paul and Anne, together with some members of the community who considered themselves close enough to Mary to be present, were sitting on leather chairs that creaked at the slightest shift of weight. Mary's final wishes were about to be revealed, and no one could predict what would happen next. The lawyer took the thick envelope of Mary's will in his hand, and everyone held their breath waiting for him to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Peter began, his voice filling the room, "I am here to perform a duty of the utmost importance and delicacy, to read the last wishes of our esteemed Mary White. If you are ready." There was a palpable air of tension in the room as Peter began to read the document he had in hand. The words were clear and unmistakable. "I leave my residence and all my personal effects to John and Sue," Peter read aloud. Gasps of surprise went through the room, and some looks of shock and disbelief were directed at John and Sue, but no one was really prepared for the bombshell that would be the next revelation. "Concerning my accumulated fortune in jewels, gold and diamonds," Peter continued, pausing for dramatic effect before announcing, "with a monetary value equivalent to several $1,000,000. The room erupted in muffled whispers. The previous tension evaporated and was replaced by palpable shock. "And so, exactly half of my fortune will be generously donated to the retirement home, the place where under different circumstances I would have spent my last days." Paul and Anna swallowed hard. Every word of his mother's will nullify the premises of an easy inheritance and a carefree life. They exchanged looks of surprise and disbelief while John and Sue nodded silently, understanding Mary's intentions. Peter continued, this time with a trace of excitement in his voice. "And the other half of my fortune." He paused for dramatic effect as his eyes scanned the astonished faces in the room. "Goes to John and Sue's children, the young Alex and Matt." Paul and Anne seemed to have lost all color. Their dreams of quick riches had crumbled like a house of cards. John and Sue, on the other hand, were stunned as they tried to understand the extent of Mary's generosity. In the end, Peter concluded the reading by choosing his words carefully. "Mary left a last message for her biological children, Paul and Anne," she paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I wish you to find the happiness you are looking for, and remember that money is not the source of joy. True joy comes from the people we love and how we treat others. You have already received the part of my money obtained from the sale of the house in a situation in which I felt cheated and practically forced. You will not see another cent." The room immediately became a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Paul and Anne were furious. John and Sue were practically motionless, trying to process Mary's unexpected generosity. One thing, however, was clear. Mary's last wish had turned everything upside down, and nothing would ever be the same again. "It's not fair," Paul complained to Anne on the way home. "We are her children. This money should—" "Paul," said Anne, her eyes shining with anger. She was stupid. She didn't know what he was doing. Meanwhile, John and Sue were in shock. They never expected to receive anything from Mary, much less a house and a fortune. "We can't accept it," said Sue, visibly shaken. "She was our friend, not our benefactor." "I agree," John replied, taking her hand. "But perhaps we can use this fortune to do something good, as Mary would have wanted." While the storm was raging, Mary's last wishes sent the neighborhood into fibrillation. The following weeks promised to be full of tension as the Hares prepared for a battle that could change their lives forever. Paul and Anne sought out the best lawyers money could buy, trying to contest Mar's will. She was stupid. She didn't have a clear mind when she made this will, Paul claimed in court. On the other hand, John and Sue, together with the lawyer Peter, were ready to defend Mary's will and her honor. Mary was fully aware of her actions. "This whole claim is just an act of greed," claimed Peter. The court sessions were intense. Testimony was heard, evidence presented, and nerves were on edge. Finally, the judge gave the verdict after examining all the evidence, and the jury was in the courtroom. The verdict was clear. Mary White was in full possession of her mental faculties when she wrote the will. Therefore, the attempt to contest it was rejected. When the decision was announced, silence fell in the courtroom. Paul and Anne were shocked, while John and Sue felt a mixture of relief and sadness. "It's not over," Paul threatened John and Sue as they left the court. "I will take the matter to the Court of Appeal." In reality, that remained only a threat dictated by anger. John and Sue, instead dedicated themselves to honoring Mary's legacy in the most meaningful way possible. They invested their children's inheritance in education and established funds for needy children. Mary White's story served to remind the entire neighborhood that true wealth does not come from material goods, but from love and kindness. And you? What would you have done in Mary's shoes? Would you have left part of the inheritance to your two children, Paul and Anne?